everyone, this is Nick from Tenacity.ai with my co-host Jason, and you're listening to the Cloud Cost Optimization Podcast. Today we're going to talk about what we're seeing a lot in the news, especially around Twitter, but more broadly, just from the global economy and what's going on is the topic is layoffs and where it's impacting technology organizations or high-tech organizations across the globe. In the impact that has really on cloud spending and thinking about cost containment overall in what can happen in those organizations as key talent is no longer with the organization. So Jason, I think first frame up the topic. We're seeing layoffs kind of hit in a lot of areas. It's been ramping up for the past, I would say, 6 months that we've seen a lot of activity.
Really accelerated.
What's typical?
It was really accelerated in the last 2 weeks. People have been talking about it for 6 months. When is it? When is the downturn coming? But now you've got AWS is on even AWS is on a hiring freeze, and they're looking at their lower performers, right, to see if they can cut some of their operating expenses. So, even if the cloud providers are doing it, definitely their customers and consumers are doing it across the board. And whether that's in the form of maybe even you might be just looking to cut costs, cut cloud spend to avoid having to lay off some people, right? But I would say across every boardroom in America right now, given inflation, given where the world economy is, right, and the global inflation, I think every boardroom is this is a topic of conversation in every boardroom right now.
I think so. And, I've been through a number of downturns at this point in my career. And, I've seen layoffs happen in a number or downsizing or whatever label you want to put on it. But at the end of the day, it's layoffs. Come in a number of different strategies or different ways that they're implemented. But I think something that we're seeing right now that's a little different than I've experienced in the past, especially with Twitter and the news, is it's not a slice of some sort of like, okay, we're going to stack rank based on some sort of set of performance indicators, we're going to cut the bottom 5% or bottom 10% performance. And we were talking about massive layoffs and key personnel are leaving some of these organizations, whether willingly during the kind of RIF action that's happening or being caught up in it as well. I think that's in my experience fundamentally a little different than what I've seen inside of other organizations. And that certainly is going to have an impact on the organization, their performance from a technology perspective, certainly from a cloud spending perspective, which is going to focus on here. But more broadly, there can be a pretty significant impact. I mean, what just Jason, in your experience, what's the sort of impact you can expect from a kind of that set of layoffs that happens at the 5 or 10% level versus, what would we expect to happen when layoffs are hitting the, 20, 30, 40, 50% of staff?
Well, couple things, I think. First off, if the numbers start getting 30, 40% of staff laid off, that number's probably going to be more like 2/3 because you're going to have a bunch of people. Look at Twitter, right? I mean, because it's not like the body of work changes. So if you lay off half of your staff and then ask the other half of your staff to work twice as hard, you're probably going to churn out another, 15, 20%, right? Because there will be people that go, no, I'm not doing that. And so, I think once numbers start getting into that range, you're now at a point, one, obviously the business might not have been managed well before. That's neither here nor there. But, you're getting into the point where you're really running the risk of just even maintaining operations, let alone doing any cleanup to make sure you're saving as much as you can on cloud costs or in other areas of the business, right? I mean, you lose your ability to do anything other than potentially keep the lights on when you're talking about 40, 50% of your staff. And so I think, I've been through a couple of them as well. The one that I don't know if this works at these really large organizations, but it's always better when you try to preserve as many jobs as you can, realistically. And so asking people to take pay cuts and minimizing the percentage of staff that you actually have to churn, in my opinion, is probably a better way to handle these situations, because we did this before in the past, where you sit people down. Everybody here, they're adults, right? I mean, it doesn't matter how many of them they are, and you explain the situation and say, we need to do this. Here are the numbers. Everyone's doing it. We're all in this together, and we're going to get through this, because there will be a point when when things come back, right? And so, that would be the ideal way. Then you don't lose all of those people resources, because that's actually the biggest thing. What will happen when you lose that many is costs will start to run rampant, because you're not doing some of the things that you were doing from a normal process perspective.
Well, I think, human capital can be really hard to acquire, especially, trusted, good, has a whole lot of knowledge about the organization. That can be hard. I see, if I were to break this down, I see, layoffs sort of come in kind of three categories, or three causes. And there's also, a set of outcomes that happen as well. In my experience, there's a set of layoffs that are kind of the normal, like, we need to make cost cuts. We're going to have to cut, 10% across the board. And, you're looking for areas to save all across the organization and all across, your spending, whether it's COGS or OPEX or wherever you're trying to save. And it's generally due to some sort of revenue downturn, or some sort of churn in the customer base, or maybe the unit economics aren't working for the stage you're at based on external forces, what's happening upon you. And so, sometimes there's trade-offs that can be made. Like, well, wait a minute, if I can save all of that 10% inside of this bucket, maybe my AWS bucket, right? Can I go save way more there than I need to cut elsewhere? Can I then preserve my human capital? That's a really good strategy, and that's an ideal scenario to be in. The second sort of scenario that happens in layoffs is there isn't a capability to do the cut needs to be so deep that there isn't really a capability to preserve staff through lower wages or through cuts elsewhere in the organization. This is generally in a scenario, early stage organizations go through this. Maybe they miss their next series raise. Maybe they're in a cash preservation scenario where they need to stretch their burn. That's a little bit different scenario. Nobody's fault. It's just a different way of looking at your financial statements and what's going on inside of the organization. In the third sort of scenario I've seen, and this is the awful scenario, and I think it's some of what we're seeing in the news right now, is that sometimes the layoff is unfortunately a hit list. It's there to make a point. Mm-hmm. And so there isn't a trade-off. There isn't I can go save elsewhere in the organization. I think these types of layoffs are actually pretty rare, but they do happen. I do think that what we're seeing at Twitter started as trying to send a message, and it's evolved into something much bigger than that. But I've also seen this in organizations I've been in the past where the leadership team was trying to send a message around how spending was done and how around certain organizations, and this is way back in my past, but it doesn't usually work out the way that I think that leadership intends it to. Frankly, I've seen leaders that have done that once and not ever done that again, and that's where there isn't a lot of trade-off. So what we really want to talk about though is the scenario where organizations are just trying to find costs. And labor is one of those places where they can find potential savings, but there are other places in the organization you can go. And so, what are some of the just thinking in terms of cloud spending, technology spending, what are some of the impacts of doing a layoff like that, where sort of you get this peanut butter spread across the sandwich? We're going to cut some labor. What sort of impact does that have on the organization itself?
Yeah, I think the less people you have, the less time you have to do all of the things that all of the things outside just keeping the lights on and running, which include they include all of your efforts around cloud spend optimization. I mean, it's not just there, though. It's across the board, right? I mean, there's a lot of work in organizations making sure that that we're leveraging all of the things that we spend operating expenses on a monthly basis to making sure that we're optimizing those things, especially if you're doing those things. I mean, there's, if you're laying off half your staff, you might not be doing those things to begin with. But there's a whole bunch of work that goes into just managing things. One of those being cloud infrastructure. You could say vendor management. You could say ERP management. There's so many things, right? And so the first thing that goes is all the stuff that I'm doing that are in addition to what it takes to keep the lights on, like DR. You're not doing that stuff anymore, right? You're not doing DR tests. You might still keep all that stuff.
Business continuity, right?
Yeah, disaster recovery, business continuity. You're probably not managing the spend across all your cloud providers, software, infrastructure, AWS, Azure, whatever, Zoom, list them all. You're probably not doing those either.
Tell you what, engineers don't do that normally anyway. So that's definitely not happening.
The last thing that engineers want to do is clean up. Well, so that's the first thing that goes.
Well, I think let's hit on that, because cleanup is actually is something that's inside of the operational umbrella that, we as engineers, we do have this desire to keep things neat and orderly. It doesn't always work out because there's so much work sometimes coming at you, and there's a lot of urgency around certain things, especially those things that are very revenue aligned. And guess what? Cleanup is not ever revenue aligned. So, trying to get those done, there will be these moments when you finally get this moment of clarity and freedom, and you can go tweak something, clean it up, refactor some code or get rid of some infrastructure. What I have definitely seen inside of organizations that are scaling back their human capital is that's a task that's just never going to get done. Like that's, there will be legacy components that just hang out until the next batch of the next successful wave, right? The next successful peak, when there's that batch of staff that's going through and saying, well, wait a minute, we're refactoring the entire app. What is all this stuff that's hanging out? That's when it'll finally get cleaned up. And that's a whole lot of waste over time to be hanging on to.
Absolutely.
I think the other thing that is important to recognize is, when it comes to layoffs, there's kind of like three types of labor that get thought about. And I think the thing that leaders are looking at is, I got all this labor that's nice to have, but all this work, I should say, not labor, all this work that is nice to have done, but I don't really, it's not strategic. I don't have to have that done. And so, when a leadership team, the further removed they are from the kind of front line, when they think about this sort of work, I think they think about it as easy to kind of bundle up into, one thing or one person, and we're going to eliminate that one role, and then, it'll be okay. We're just not going to do that work. The second type of work is the, the maybe most important. It's the absolutely got to keep the lights on, got to, serve the revenue, got to go deliver on the revenue we're going to sell. And so that's the other end of that spectrum. That's really important. And, we're going to make sure that staff is focused on that. And again, it's kind of an ideal that we're going to have staff focused on that. But there's all this work in the middle that is the maintenance, the care and feeding, the things that have to happen. Now, they don't have to happen to keep the lights on, but they do have to happen in order to keep you, say, secure, or able to respond in an emergency, or able to continue managing your vendor relationships or your spending. And that's the work that oftentimes starts to falter in these organizations, at least in my experience, having gone through and had to experience rifts inside of organizations or downsizing, oftentimes having to lead teams where we've lost 10 or 15% of our labor force. None of that nice to have work is neatly bundled up in one role, right? It was a bunch of people that were critical for certain things, and they had the institutional knowledge and they had the know-how to do those things. And now we got to take and we got to layer that onto a bunch of people who don't know how to do that. And so there becomes this kind of inefficiency. And it can create quite a ripple inside the organization. So, I think the message I want to take away from that is it's never kind of as neatly bundled up as I think leaders think it is. And certainly sitting in a leadership role, it's never as neatly bundled up as I would love to think about work and labor and roles. But it is, it is much easier as a leader when I can go and look at another line item on my balance sheet, or another place in my financial statements, and make a cut from an account. If I can go reduce my spending for a certain vendor, for my connectivity, or for my software, or for my AWS spend or my Azure spend, and preserve that human capital and not disrupt the sort of operation that needs to be run efficiently, that's always a better outcome.
You'll save more money in the long run than you will just by cutting staff.
Well, that's true. That's by experience, anecdotally, that's absolutely true. I can't point to a study that says that, but anecdotally, having gone through this 3 times in my career, that's absolutely true.
It's like this. It's like if you only make a decision about this stuff, about humans, with data driven from a spreadsheet, you're going to miss what that portion of. It's hard to quantify what will happen when I have the lack of something. you know what I mean?
Well,
it's just hard to quantify.
Spreadsheets are really good at quantifying things. They're really horrible at qualifying things. So you lose all the context. Go. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah,
absolutely.
Great way to describe it.
Well, is it, any parting thoughts here, Jason, before we wrap the show?
I think that was it.
All right, fantastic. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Tune in next time. We'll talk about more cloud cost optimization strategies and the sorts of things that are happening in the world that impact them. Thanks, everyone.